Then I'm going to talk about mammals and biodiversity. And I'm going to start with some basics. 3 sections to the talk, and we'll start off, ease you into mammals. I think it's appropriate that we're ending the series with mammals. After all, we're at the top of the scale, right? So I'm happy about that. I know Dr. Jones talked to you last week, I think it was last week already, a little bit about the Linnaean system of binomial nomenclature and the principle of priority, et cetera, and I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that. But I do want to review the taxonomic hierarchy, which you may have learned back in high school or back in college, because I'm going to talk about a few different things besides or in addition to species in this talk. The highest level we have when we classify animals is the kingdom. Then we have the phylum, chordata. Let's pretend we're classifying this giraffe here that's here on the right. Chordates are animals that have a notochord. It's kind of like a backbone. They have segmented musculature, a lot of other features that I'm not going to go into here. Of course, a giraffe is a mammal. That's what we're going to focus on today. Then comes the order, the family, the genus, and the species. And I think Andy talked a lot about genus and species. Keep in mind that we have binomial species names. You can't use the second part by itself. That's called a specific epithet. You have to italicize them. If you can't write in italics, you just underline it. That works too. These levels can be modified by prefixes. We can talk about superorders or subfamilies or infraorders, which means there's really an infinite number of levels that we can put into this classification scheme. And for that reason, when I talk to people about mammals and teach my students, I don't have them focus too much on a lot of these intermediate stages. The ones I'd like you to pay attention to are the class, which are mammals. You can pay attention to it and then ignore it, because we're just going to be talking about mammals. But this is the big group, right? We have birds and mammals and lizards and snakes. The orders are what are the main groups of mammals. Typical types that you'd be familiar with, like carnivorans, bats, whales, rodents, rabbits, etc. These are the big groups, and I'll talk about a few of these. And then families are the subtypes. If we're talking about carnivorans, examples of families would be things like cats, dogs, bears, etc. So if you can remember the orders and the families, those are what we're going to be focusing on tonight. But this is really an important point. Taxonomy is a human construct, and it is subjective. If there's one thing we believe as biologists, it's that all this diversity that we have evolved over time, and we're all connected genealogically. And this hierarchical structure where we like to take animals and stick them in boxes is really just our convenient way of communicating about different groups. And because it's subjective, different taxonomists, different evolutionary biologists can disagree about different levels in the taxonomic hierarchy. So always keep that at the back of your mind. It's true that things are genetically related, and we hope that our classification reflects that. A good example of this is the subspecies. I'm a paleontologist. I feel lucky if I can identify something to species level. I don't deal with subspecies for the most part. But neontologists will often deal in subspecies. And in theory, these are groups of animals that could potentially breed with other ones, but usually have some characteristics that allow you to recognize them consistently. The challenge is that one person's species may be another person's subspecies and vice versa. And this has resulted in a phenomenon that's known as taxonomic inflation. And inflation is never a good thing. The definition really of taxonomic inflation is when a subspecies are raised, or when various subspecies are raised to species level as a result of a change in species concept rather than new discoveries. You're not going out and finding a new giraffe, which would really be news, but rather you're saying that the 6 recognized subspecies of giraffes all represent new species. If you go out and do that, all of a sudden you're changing the species counts. Not a big deal. Science is about change. Maybe we all agree that we need a different species concept and everything changes. That would be all right. The problem is that this taxonomic inflation is not random. For example, large charismatic animals like monkeys, especially those that are active during the day, tend to be inflated more often than those that are hard to see. Small things like shrews, which makes sense. Additionally, animals like this deer that I can photograph in my backyard, unfortunately, those tend to be inflated more often too because they live near biologists. So animals that live, and this is certainly true if you're close to a university, close to a concentration of scientists, or you're in a biological hotspot, you're going to get inflated more often than not. And that makes it difficult if you want to ask, okay, how many cats are there versus dogs, and why has that happened Why has it evolved that way over the past 65 million years? So that's just something to think about. We can talk more about that later. I'm going to set that aside because, as I said, I'm not really dealing down to the low level. We're mostly going to be talking about higher level mammal taxonomy and trends. Before that, we really need to ask the question, what is a mammal? A mammal is defined by its ancestry. Just like you may be a Starkman or a Croft based on your parents, a mammal is a mammal depending on what it evolved from. That's the fundamental definition. Now, because of the shared ancestry among all mammals, they have a variety of features in common. And we can use these features oftentimes to recognize a mammal. So let's take your favorite mammal, cat, dog, hamster, chinchilla, whatever it is. And I'm sure you can come up with a list of different characteristics that you would say allow you to recognize this as a mammal. Some of the big ones are that it has hair or fur, something you only find in mammals. They are endothermic and homeothermic. Those are kind of mouthfuls of a word. Endothermic means that we're able to generate our own heat, which is unique to mammals and a few other groups. And homeothermic means we tend to maintain it at a constant temperature. And in humans, that happens to be 37 degrees Celsius. I'm a scientist, if you please. Lactation and parental care. Not all mammals give live birth, but they all do lactate, and usually there's some degree of parental care, oftentimes a lot. And we have well-developed sensory organs, although this varies depending on what type of mammal you are. As a primate, we tend to focus a lot on our eyes. A dog, it may be more their nose. Bats, it may be their ears. So this can vary. The challenge, as a paleontologist, is that many of these features are not evident in fossils, or they can be modified or lost in some species. I can't tell, at least right now, if something's endothermic or homeothermic from its bones. There are people working on that, and we might be able to do it eventually, but it's a challenge. Same thing with lactation. So I have to rely on bone characters and tooth characters oftentimes to recognize if something's a mammal. And there's one really important characteristic that most people have recognized that say, you know, this is really a good way to recognize a mammal, and that has to do with the jaw joint and the middle ear bones. This is a diagram of a non-mammal, an animal that's extinct, that's closely related to the origin of mammals, and its jaw bones are colored in there. And there are several jaw bones pictured. There's one with teeth in red and a variety behind them. You don't have to worry about all the details. The important point is that the jaw joint sits right there between the blue and the yellow bone, which are the quadrate and the articular. And it just has one middle ear bone, just like a bird, just like a dinosaur, just like a crocodile. In a mammal, we have a jaw joint that's between the red bone and the white bone there, the squamosal and the dentary, and we have 3 ear bones because we can trace through evolutionary time that those, what are known as postdentary bones, got smaller and smaller and were captured by the middle ear and became our incus and our malleus. So 3 middle ear bones and a dentary squamosal jaw joint are the one way to surely recognize a mammal in the fossil record. And we could talk more about that too. It's one of the great evolutionary transformations that we have. If we rely on that definition of a mammal to recognize that earliest ancestor of a mammal, then the first mammals originated about 225 million years ago, which may surprise you because this is when about dinosaurs originated too. And it's not the fact that dinosaurs came first and mammals later. Mammals were just hanging around, evolving mostly during the night, or at least living during the night. They evolved whenever they want. And we're mostly small size, so we don't see them as often. And most of these did not leave any living descendants. The oldest branch that left living descendants are the monotremes, and the common ancestor of all mammals that are alive today we think lived about 190 million years ago. And monotremes are really a pretty cool group, so I'm going to just spend a tiny bit of time talking about them. They include one order. There's that taxonomic hierarchy again. That includes the echidnas and the platypus. So only 2 families and only 5 species that are alive today. And their name means one whole, that monotremata, and it refers to the cloaca. And the cloaca is a common space in the body into which the products of both the reproductive and the excretory tracts dump. So they don't go out of the body separately, they go into one space. And that's a primitive characteristic that monotremes have, and they do have some other primitive characteristics. However, I don't want you to go away thinking that these are just primitive mammals, because in fact they have a mix of advanced and primitive characteristics. For example, that platypus snout, that is advanced. That has electroreceptors on it that can sense small perturbations in the field so this thing can hunt fishes underwater. I guarantee that was not present in the common ancestor of all mammals. So they're really a neat group, even though there aren't many of them around. Their fossils are also known from Argentina, from about 55 million years ago, which suggests that they dispersed to South America at some point and subsequently went extinct. They probably got there across Antarctica before it glaciated, of course. Going back to our cladogram here, there are a variety of extinct groups that lived along with the early monotremes during the age of dinosaurs, and then we have the two really successful groups of modern mammals, the placentals and the marsupials. The marsupials include 7 main types, 7 orders, and these are distributed almost evenly between the New World and the Old World. There are 3 types of New World marsupials and include 95 species. And this really surprises people because there are only about 320 species total. There are a lot of marsupials on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. The Old World marsupials, which are primarily in Australia, include 4 orders and 231 species. Some of the New World marsupials are going to be familiar to you. They include the Virginia possum, which you can find all over Cleveland Heights, and a lot of its relatives, which you have to go to Costa Rica or Brazil to see. Half a dozen of these little things called shrew opossums, which are really neat little animals. And then finally, the cute little Monito del Monte, which is not really a little monito. It's a member of its own order that lives off the coast of Chile, or in the Valdivian rainforest of Chile. The Old World marsupials are more familiar to most people. They include kangaroos, and its order also includes things like wombats and koalas and possums and couscouses, et cetera, et cetera. That's the big group of Old World marsupials. We also have the meat-eating ones, things like the Tasmanian devil, marsupial moles, of which there are 2 species, and they are super cool, and the bilbies and bandicoots, which are sort of like the marsupial versions of rabbits, which is why in Australia you can buy chocolate bilbies at Easter rather than chocolate rabbits. Not to mention the fact that rabbits have really mucked up the ecosystems in Australia. Placentals, it's no surprise, they have radiated spectacularly, and they include a staggering 21 different orders. And this is a diagram of how they're all related to one another. We can group them into 4 main groups, and this is based on a variety of different genetic data. When we try to get at these early divergences, it's very difficult with the structure of animals, but sometimes genes can provide some insights. And they tell us that there are really 4 main groups of placental mammals. One group called Afrotheria that may have originated in Africa. It includes such animals as elephants, hyraxes, sea cows, aardvarks, sengis, and some other animals. Really a neat group, one of my favorites. The xenarthrans, sloths, armadillos, and anteaters, probably originated in South America, although we're not sure. A big group, Laurasiatheria, which refers to them being primarily found in North America and in Asia. A lot of insectivores like hedgehogs and shrews, the ungulates, the whales, the bats, and the ever popular carnivores. And finally, our own group, Euarchonoglyres, which includes the tree shrews, colugos, and primates, along with rodents and rabbits. And most people don't like to find that they're in our same group, but they are indeed. These are the 4 main supraordinal groups of mammals. And one of the key questions we're trying to ask is, when did these 4 groups separate? Was it during the age of the dinosaurs? And did they just evolve along slowly and radiate explosively after the KT extinction? Or did they really diverge very close to when the dinosaurs went extinct? And there's still a lot of debate going on right now about that question. In terms of species, this is how it sorts out. There are about 5,400 species of mammals, and I have to say about because literally there are new species being described every day. The vast majority of them, 42%, are rodents. Speaking of depressing, more than 1/3 of all mammal species described are rodents. The second most diverse group, which most people aren't familiar with, are the bats. Another personal favorite of mine, topic of my high school term paper, which made me eminently popular, as you can imagine. So to put this in perspective, if you picked randomly 3 species on the surface of this globe, 2 of them would be either rodents or bats, and they will inherit the earth. Next are shrews, and only in 4th place do we get primates, but you have to take it with a grain of salt because we said primates are prone to taxonomic inflation. And so there's some question about how many species there actually are, and I think we just nudged out the carnivores because of some changes recently. But that's how it all sorts out, and marsupials, there really aren't a whole lot of them.
All these different species Are there more species today than there were millions of years ago? And does the amount of diversity go up all the time, or up and down, or down all the time?
As best as we can tell from the fossil record, with the caveat that the fossil record isn't perfect, it does seem that diversity, species diversity, is increasing over time. Whether or not that actually corresponds to morphological diversity, we don't know, but that does seem to be the trend. There were, in aggregate, certainly more species in the past than there are today. I was just talking to a guy who's trying to compile all the mammal species that have been ever been named, and he was at 15,000. So right there, that's 3 times as many as we have right now. Now, of course, those span at least 65 million years. I think he's probably including Mesozoic mammals, in which case it's 225 million. So it's a little tough to get at any one point in time. But we do think species are increasing. If we go back and look at one spot, let's say 30 million years ago, when I look at mammals, study mammals in South America, we'll see similar species diversity as what we see today.
Some plant biologist who studies orchid species was teasing me once about being a primate and being interested in primates, because he said, we're not very speciose. But on the basis of what you just said, for a mammal, we're fine.
Compared to a mammal, we're doing pretty well, actually. Of course, most of these primates they're pretty small ones that folks might not be familiar with. There are some radiations on Madagascar and in some other places too. And there is that question of what's exactly a species or not. But compared to aardvarks, the Monito del Monte, we're doing great.
Is there a correlation between size in this biodiversity? Rodents making up 42%, but they're very small. Habitat and size?
There does not, well, let me say, there seems to be an inverse relationship to some extent between size and diversity. Not all rodents are small. In fact, we'll take a look at some that are pretty big. But it's difficult to be very diverse when you're very large, because you reproduce more slowly and you have a larger home range. And one of the fundamental tenets of ecology is that you can't have 2 animals in the same place doing the exact same thing. And if you are small, it's relatively easier to find a lot of different niches and to diversify, whereas you're big, it's much more difficult. So for example, something like elephants, we see only 3 species today, and if you look in the past, you never see one spot where you have more than a handful of them at any one time. And that's certainly not the case for something like rodents or even for something like smaller hoofed animals.
So you identified the 4 groups of mammals. On what basis are they put in a group? What makes a group?
These 4 superordinal groups that I went through are based on genetic analyses that use a variety of different techniques. One of the strongest lines of evidence that they brought to bear are these signs, which are small interspersed nuclear something or other, but they're chains of DNA that are inserted into the genome, probably by viruses, and it's very unlikely that the same exact sequence would be inserted into the genomes of 2 different mammals if they weren't related from one another. And we have found these for groups like Aphrotheria. We haven't found them for all of them, but it's those type of data that really provide the strongest evidence for these. Now what we as paleontologists are doing are going back and trying to see, are there morphological characters that also we can use to recognize fossil members of these groups? And that's a little bit more challenging. One thing that we can do is combine the data in our analyses and say, okay, let's assume that these are the 4 major groups. What happens if you put fossils in here? How do relationships within those groups sort out? And that's often what we do now with analyses of evolutionary relationships.
Going back to your question before last about size and surface, would that also be true for dinosaurs who inhabited a much greater area and their diversification?
It does appear to be the case for dinosaurs to some extent. The challenge with the fossil record is that your probability of being preserved is better if you're bigger. Therefore, the fossil record may be biased to some extent towards bigger things, and in fact, smaller things we're actually less likely to find. And it's a little tougher to say with certainty for things like dinosaurs that aren't around today if that also affected them. But as a general rule, that's typically the case. You don't see really large animals at high numbers of species of really large animals. Whales are another good example. They aren't really that many species of them, and partly because they do have these very large home ranges, probably. Let's move on a little bit and talk about what is biodiversity. Speaking of rodents that aren't small. Biodiversity usually refers to taxonomic diversity. such as the number of species or the numbers of families or the numbers of orders. Usually, this is also in some geographic context. For example, if you can recognize that as a kangaroo that's peeking up over the edge there, you know that this is a photograph that was taken in Australia. One of the prime factors that affects species diversity is area. As you get a bigger area, you get more species. And that's hopefully intuitive, and we could talk about lots of reasons about why that is. But if you're comparing taxonomic counts, it's important to compare equal areas. But anyway, when we talk about biodiversity, it's generally in a certain place, and we're generally counting numbers of species or other taxa. If you're counting, you then need to ask a question: how do we measure biodiversity? Is it simple counts? And it is simple counts to some extent, but there are a couple different sorts of counts that we can do. There's a term known as alpha diversity, and this is the number of species in a community or habitat. And when people talk about alpha taxonomy, when I do alpha taxonomy, I'm sorting out species. What species is this? What species is that? It's really the fundamental type of analysis that has to be done before you can do any sort of biodiversity studies. And I know Andy Jones hammered this in at how important it is to have museum collections so you can undertake this sort of alpha taxonomics research. Typically, when we talk about alpha diversity, it's on a small scale, less than 10 square kilometers. For example, North Chagrin Reservation. You could count the number of mammal species that are there and come up with the alpha diversity for North Chagrin Reservation, or for Shaker Lakes, or for a comparable park somewhere else. And this might be what it looks like. If each of these letters is a different species, you go out there in census, you hope you count all of the different species. You then circle them up, see what it looks like, and you have an alpha diversity of 4. That's pretty straightforward. Ecologists will also talk about gamma diversity, however. And I do know that I skipped a letter. I'll come back to that one. Gamma diversity is the number of species in a region. And this is typically between 10 and 10,000 square kilometers. For example, something on the order of Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Not a really big national park like Zion, but kind of a medium-sized one. And you can imagine that the diversity is going to be different, not only because it's bigger, but because there are more individual habitats in that area. So this may be the area of Cuyahoga Valley National Park. You look at how many species are there overall, you eliminate the duplicates, and you come up with a different number of species that, of course, at least has to be equal to your alpha diversity in one of those subsets. The beta diversity is a different type of count. It's not counting numbers of species absolutely. What it does is it measures change in species among the habitats. And the way you calculate this, someone asked me if there'd be math, and this is all the math, so there's not too much. You take the gamma diversity, and you're dividing it by the average alpha diversity to come up with the beta diversity. So if we look back at all our letter species that are in Cuyahoga Valley National Park, we do a number of surveys to assess alpha diversity. We come up with a beta diversity of 1.5 because we are dividing 6 by 4. We might have another park that has a different distribution of habitats, maybe fewer species in each habitat, but an equal number of species overall. And it might look something like this. We can do the same exercise, and even though there are the same number of species overall, that being 6, this has a beta diversity of 3. That's because there's a lower number of species in each area, and we get greater species turnover. This can be very important when you're thinking about conservation priorities. If you have a park like the one below, it's going to be important to save every single habitat that's there because they're harboring different species. That's correlated with high beta diversity, lots of change as you go through the environment. Whereas the top example, it might not be quite such of a priority if you're able to figure out a trade-off that allows you to do something else. And that's why these sorts of measures are important. So biodiversity isn't just one number. It's one of these things you have to ask. Think about what's the question you're trying to answer first. Endemism is related to beta diversity. Areas that have high levels of endemism that are very different from adjacent areas usually have high levels of beta diversity. If we move from a small level and go up to the highest level and ask what patterns do we see in faunas over the globe, we can talk about biogeographic realms. And these are mainly based on plants, but animals tend to be concordant with these. And so these are the ones that I teach to my students and that are good to be familiar with. And like anything in science, these are debated. People come up with new schemes about whether there should be more. I don't think anyone ever says there should be fewer. So it's a little bit under flux. But these have been recognized for 150 years or so. Here in North America, we're in the Nearctic realm in the northern hemisphere. And the number in the parentheses is the number of families of mammals that are endemic to that region, which means they're only found in this region today. And they both happen to be rodents. They're the mountain beaver and pocket gophers, for what that's worth. The Palearctic region only has a single endemic group. The Neotropical region is quite different. This comprises South America and extends up into the tropical parts of Mexico. A whopping 28 mammal species are endemic, more in any other continent. Afrotropic region has 20 endemic species. Indo-Malayan has 8 endemic species. And the Australian region has 21 endemic families, sorry, not endemic species. Just looking at this very coarse scale of families instead of species, we can start to see some patterns. One pattern is that the tropical regions are much more diverse, at least in terms of endemic families, than the northern ones. And the reason for this probably has to do with dispersal. If you're a tropically adapted organism like a monkey, it's going to be very difficult for you to exist in the Nearctic, and more importantly, very difficult for you to get somewhere else where you can be happy. You can't go up through the Nearctic, through the Palearctic, and down to the Apotropic. So just the way that the continents are today, we've isolated these tropical areas so they each are evolving along their own lines. The other thing that we can't see quite so much from this one, but is true, is that as we go to the equator, there is a general increase in species diversity. And this is a phenomenon that's known as the latitudinal diversity gradient. And it's one of the phenomena that's been recognized for the longest amount of time in the ecological literature. This is a heat map of modern mammal diversity. Cold colors, such as blue, indicate relatively low numbers of species. Warm colors indicate higher numbers of species. And you can see the pattern here. It increases as we go towards the equator. The $65,000 question, maybe $65 million question, is why is that? And this has been debated for as long as people have recognized this pattern. One possibility is that we get greater origination rates in the tropics, so that after millions of years, you're accumulating more species there than in other areas. Now, what causes that greater origination rate? That'd be another question. People speak of that as a cradle. The other end of the spectrum is the museum. Maybe there are lower extinction rates in the tropics. We're generating species equally all over the globe, but they tend to go extinct more often in these less hospitable environments in Cleveland than they do down in the center of Brazil. So again, after millions of years, you end up accumulating more species. Perhaps there's greater habitat diversity in the tropics. This could result in greater niche space, allow for more coexistence of different species. Maybe this just pushes the question down the road because there are lots of plants there. There might be lots of niches, but that then makes you wonder why there's so many plants. Or maybe this is really an abiotic pattern, that the greater temperature and the greater amount of solar energy that you get in the tropics allows a greater carrying capacity in the tropics, and so you get more and more species. As I said, there's no consensus yet on which of these is actually the case, and depending on which group you're studying and how you're measuring biodiversity, you can get different answers. An important thing to point out, though, is that this isn't just true for mammals or even for terrestrial animals. We can look at things like marine bivalves, clams, oysters, etc., that are living on the continental shelf. And this is a similar sort of heat map, and you see essentially the same pattern. It's cold near the poles, and it's nice and warm near the equator. So whatever explanation we need to come up with probably has to have fundamentally some type of abiotic explanation, and maybe in different groups, some of these museum and cradle effects can then be layered on top of it. One question that I'm particularly interested in answering, as are most paleontologists, is has it always been this way? It's one thing to speculate about why this pattern exists, and entirely another question to really establish how long it's been this way. And the only way that you can answer that question is to go to the fossil record. And people, I think, intuitively know that it's fun to go out and find things, but it's also really important. These questions about why does the pattern exist allow us to not only understand biodiversity, but hopefully conserve it going forward. This photo also reminds me that elevation can be an important factor to affect species diversity in addition to area. This is a field site that sits at about 12,000 feet, but it's in the tropics. It doesn't look very tropical. I guarantee it doesn't feel very tropical. And it doesn't have as many mammals as we have in Brazil. Topography is a great way to create new species, particularly in tropical latitudes. And that's because as you elevate a mountain range, you create temperature gradients and you create moisture gradients, and that creates new habitats. New habitats allow new niches, and that allows for speciation. So in these cloud forests like we see in Ecuador, we'll see species that live at 1,000 meters, 2,000 meters that you don't find on the floor of the neotropics. Similarly, big ranges like the Andes Mountains can allow speciation because it divides populations that were once connected. So there are a couple different ways that we can see this phenomenon in effect. To illustrate it, here is a map of mammal species diversity of North America. You can see that going from north to south, there's that latitudinal diversity gradient, right? We get more species as we go north to south. But look at those red areas. Those are the areas of highest species diversity. These are areas of high topography. So if we take a single line of latitude and we trace it across from the east to the west, you see another gradient of increasing diversity. It's this topographic complexity layered on top of this whole effect of latitude. So there are lots of things that can affect species diversity. Anyone recognize what this is? It was in the news a couple months ago. This is the olinguito. It's a very cute little mammal. I think that might have been the headline. Very cuddly little mammal. It's related to raccoons. It's related to animals called olingos. And a new species was discovered just this year. And it's remarkable because big species, carnivores, primates, it's not that common to discover new species. And this one had been under our noses for a long time, so it made news. This animal is found in these sorts of habitats only. The cloud forests of Colombia, Ecuador, and northern Peru. It's a great example of a species that evolved solely because there is this new niche that evolved thanks to plate tectonics and the evolution of mountains. So biology is inextricably linked to large-scale processes like plate tectonics and like the environment. In addition to taxonomic diversity, we can talk about morphological diversity. And this is often correlated with ecological diversity. In other words, we can ask the question, here's a family of mammals that has 15 species. Here's another one that has 16 species. They're about the same taxonomically. Are they the same in terms of morphological diversity? And this, I think, is a really fun exercise because there are lots of great examples of groups that are relatively small that have high morphological diversity. This is particularly evident in phenomena that we call adaptive radiations. When an ancestral mammal or population gets to an area where it experiences presumably low competition and then radiates out to fill all sorts of new niches. One of my favorite examples are caviomorph rodents. These are rodents that dispersed to South America from Africa probably 45 million years ago, probably on a raft of vegetation. They then found a continent without rodents, and they went crazy and evolved into all sorts of these great non-rodent-like rodents, from guinea pigs all the way up to the capybara. What's remarkable about this radiation is that it's been proposed that these animals fill niches in South America, which was on an island, that other mammal groups do on other continents. So for example, the cavy is very much like an African hyrax, which is in its own order. The paca is remarkably similar to a little ungulate called a water chevrotain, also African. And the capybara is similar to the pygmy hippo. Great example of convergent evolution within an adaptive radiation. This is one of the reasons why I like to work in South America. Get neat rodents like this. Not to be left out, our second most speciose group, the bats. This is another fantastic adaptive radiation that most people aren't familiar with. These are the phyllostomid bats, the New World leaf-nosed bats. And these fill virtually every niche in terms of diet that can be filled, more than basically any other order. We have carnivorous forms that are specialists on amphibians. In the upper right there, we have pollen and nectar-feeding bats. That yellow stuff is pollen. You can see it's got a long snout for sticking its snout into flowers. Vampirum is the largest New World bat. Artibius is a frugivore. A lot of these animals are frugivorous and live in the tropical forests. And then, of course, we also get dietary generalists. And not to be left out, we have the vampire bat. So these really remarkably radiated in South America, an excellent example about how taxonomic diversity may or may not be related to morphological diversity.
With Homo sapiens, there is quite a diversity. Would you classify various ones as subspecies? Obviously, morphological changes and due to location and diet and that type of thing.
I wouldn't, because I'm a lumper rather than a splitter, which are two terms for people who tend to lump things together into one species or split them up into subspecies. But I think it would really come down to your species definition. And this is something I talked about a few years ago. And that can vary depending on your field of specialty and what question you're trying to ask. So it all comes down to that. You could, I think, you could try to make a case for subspecies, but generally, especially given the mixing that we're seeing now, I think most folks would classify humans all as a single species.
Actually, on another note, since you mentioned the bats, anything new on the disappearance of the bats, the fungus, the white mouth, and all that type of thing?
I think the only new news is that it keeps spreading, unfortunately, and that they're trying to isolate different. This is this fungal disease, the white nose disease, for those of you not familiar, that's decimating lots of bat populations. I mean, it's really scary. It basically wakes them up, causes them to wake up in the middle of their hibernation, and they use up their reserves and they die after a few years being exposed. I know some groups like the Nature Conservancy are building artificial caves for bats to roost in. Then when they leave in the spring, they clean them out completely. And that's about the only thing that they've been able to do to try to keep it from spreading from one place or another. But I haven't heard of any new research on that front.
Darin, is there any correlation, or can you get any information from Australia about rates of new species appearing and extinctions? Because obviously that was somewhat separated, and you've got lots of specific species. And correlated with that, it struck me that although you had maximum species in the tropics, that piece around Singapore, Malaysia, and Indonesia was very low in specific species complexity. Why?
Well, I'll start with the latter one, because that one's closer on my memory. I think that area, to some extent, it's probably due to area, and it has less area than the other biogeographic regions, and for that reason, it has less endemism. It also turns out that with fluctuating sea levels, some of those islands were connected up with mainland Asia actually not that long ago. So you get more dispersal in that region than you might think you would have otherwise. So I think those are the two reasons why you get less overall species diversity. But I'll actually talk about a couple groups that are from that area, endemic to that area, and they're really cool. So even though there aren't that many, there are some really neat families. In terms of looking at Australia and South America are very similar in that regard as being isolated, and we would love to look at speciation rates. Australia, unfortunately, does not have a great fossil record. There are some nice fossils known from there, but it is a very tectonically quiescent place. And to be a fossil, you need to be buried, and there aren't lots of very good basins in Australia. So there are just patchy areas here and there. We have a tough time dating them. The best deposits are lake deposits in the northern part of Australia. And if anyone's listened to the news recently, there was a giant platypus described from there recently. It's about this big, which would have been pretty cool to see. And that comes from those deposits too. So I think we need a much better fossil record from Australia to start to do that. North America, we actually do have a much better fossil record for some spots, and people do try to measure speciation rates and how much morphological change you get over time, because the resolution is good enough that you can get down to 10,000 years between samples, which is really pretty spectacular. Much finer scale than we can work on in a lot of other spots. So we will head back to part 3, which are local opportunities to appreciate mammal diversity. I think it's fun to look at pictures, but I always like to look at the real bones, and I like to look at real mammals too. So what I'm going to do in this last section is just talk about what I see are edges of the mammal morphospace that you can check out close by here in Ohio. And we'll talk a little bit about some of these families and orders that I mentioned early on. Kind of a top 10, but they are in no particular order. The northern tree shrew, Tupaia belangeri, you only have to go to the Cleveland Metro Park Zoo to see this one, and that's what it looks like. You know, this one has a special place in my heart because this is one of those animals where you stand by and you see people walk by and say, oh, look at a little squirrel. It's not a squirrel. It's definitely not a squirrel. It is one of the closest living relatives of primates. And this is an unresolved question. There are primates and there are two other orders that are closest to them. These guys, tree shrews, and then colugos, which are large gliding mammals that are really cool, and you can't see any of them here in Ohio, unfortunately. But it's still not resolved which is the closer relative. But for that reason alone, you should go and check out the tree shrews. These are, I think, in the primate house, so at least they're housed appropriately. These are quick moving, quicker than squirrels, and they're vocal inhabitants of Asian forests. They have lots of calling, lots of characteristics that we tend to associate with primates. They have big eyes, and they're very unshrew-like. I'll talk about a couple different things that people call shrews, and it's not a typo. I did that intentionally, tree shrew. That's tree shrew because they're nothing to do with shrews. One kind of cool factoid about these animals is they practice what's known as quote-unquote absentee parental care, where they have a nest and they leave their very helpless young, and then the mother takes off for a day or two. She comes back, suckles them very quickly. They've got a milk that's very high in protein, and then she leaves again. And when she comes and goes, she takes different routes. So it's clearly that this is a way of hiding the babies to keep them from getting preyed upon. But it's something that you see in these tree shrews, which is kind of peculiar. The family that they belong to are Tupaiidae, and the order is Scandentia. So just like we have rodents and bats and primates, this is equally distinct. And it's a tree shrew, it's a Scandentian. This is also a close one that you can see the lesser hedgehog tenrec, Echinops telferi. You can see why it's called a hedgehog tenrec, because it looks like a hedgehog. If you go to the Cleveland Botanical Garden, go to their Malagasy area, the Madagascar desert, and there's a little cubicle down there, and you can check this animal out. Why would you want to look at this animal? Well, first of all, it's convergent with hedgehogs. I think you'd agree it looks like a hedgehog. If you Google tenrec, hedgehog tenrec, you'll come up with pictures of hedgehogs, intentionally or not. And it's part of an amazing Malagasy radiation of tenrecs. These are animals in the family Tenrecidae that are in the order Afrosoricida. They are part of that African radiation. These are animals that probably dispersed to Madagascar about 40 million years ago. We don't know because they have almost no fossil record. And they radiated out to fill the hedgehog niche, to fill the mole niche, to fill the shrew niche, to fill the small otter niche. And they do all sorts of incredible things. And again, people will walk by and say, look at the hedgehog, when in fact, it's an amazing example of convergence that's just right here in University Circle. They do have some primitive characteristics, which suggests they did disperse there early. They have a cloaca, which is what we talked about with monotremes, and they're heterothermic. I said not all mammals have all those characteristics. Many of these tenrecs have a difficult time maintaining a constant body temperature, and so they will go up and down in their temperature, and they can enter torpor, which is kind of like a short-term hibernation. They can do that every day or do it seasonally. So they're a very, very neat group of animals, and they're called tenrecs. The binturong, or the bear cat. To see this animal, you have to go to the other end of the state, down to Cincinnati, Arcticus binturong. You can see why it's called a bear cat. It's got a long, hairy coat, maybe like a black bear, but long whiskers, sort of looks cat-like. This is a frugivorous arboreal carnivoran of Southeast Asia. Now, that might seem like an oxymoron, but I said carnivoran and not carnivore. Carnivorans are members of the order Carnivora. And carnivorans have undergone their own interesting radiation, and not all of them eat meat. Some of them eat fruit. And this is a great example of one that lives in the forests of Southeast Asia that eats fruit. It's in the family Viverridae, which is an interesting grab bag of animals, and it used to be a family, and then it was split into two families, and now we're finding out that one of these viverids may be the earliest, most primitive branch of the carnivore family tree, and other ones are sorting out. It seems like they're really a grab bag of early carnivores. So if you want to get an idea of what early carnivores looked like, learning about viverids is a good way to do it. This happens to be the largest member of that group, and it has a prehensile tail, which is pretty handy if you live in trees. I'm sure there's very high selective pressure, evolutionarily speaking, not to fall out of trees. And because of that, lots of different groups have evolved prehensile tails, including some other frugivorous carnivorans that are here on this side of the ocean in Central and South America. The tiger quoll. If you run down to Columbus, you can see a couple really cool marsupials, and this is one of them. This is Dasyurus maculatus. Really impressive looking animal. This is the largest native carnivore in Australian. And I put this one in here juxtaposed with the other to get you thinking about the ends of those words, right? Carnivoran is a member of the order Carnivora, whereas a carnivore is something that eats meat, which you may or may not be, and it may or may not be a carnivoran. This is a marsupial, so very distantly related to the placentals, but it's the largest native one in Australia. Tasmanian devils are larger, but they no longer live in mainland Australia. They're only in Tasmania. And then, of course, the thylacine of the Tasmanian wolf was bigger, but it is now extinct, unfortunately. It lives in a variety of habitats, but prefers forest, and that's probably why you get the spotted coat. It probably helps camouflage. Its overall form allows it's an ambush predator, helps hide it from its prey. And it's a member of the family Dasyuridae in the order Dasyuromorphia. So if you remember, I said there are 4 main types of Australian marsupials. There's the kangaroo one that everyone knows about, and the second one are these guys. In fact, most of the species of this order are very small, and they call them marsupial mice, even though they are small insectivorous animals. So those are what fill the insectivorous niche in Australia. They're smaller relatives. This is another real cool marsupial that's at the Columbus Zoo, the Feathertail Glider, Acrobates pygmaeus. That's a great genus name, Acrobates pygmaeus. This is the smallest gliding mammal. Gliding is a fantastic example of convergent evolution. If you go out here at night during the summer, you can see flying squirrels, which of course are actually gliding squirrels. But I can count off many other instances where mammals have evolved into gliders. And it's happened at least 3 times just among marsupials, and this is the smallest one. They live in the forests of eastern Australia. Gliders tend to live in forests for obvious reasons. And their tail's prehensile in addition to being feathered. If you look, you can see the little feathery hairs along the edge, but they can actually grip onto it a little bit too, which is kind of a neat adaptation. The other feather-tailed type animal, which happens to be another sort of tree shrew, doesn't have a prehensile tail. It's in its own family, Acrobatidae, but it's within that major group that includes wombats and koalas and kangaroos. Giant elephant shrew, another animal that's not a shrew that you can see here at the Cleveland Zoo, Rhynchocyan petersi. First of all, these are just beautiful animals. The coloration on those are spectacular. They have a long mobile snout and long limbs. That, of course, where they get their name from, elephant shrew, that long mobile snout. Their long limbs mean that they're cursorial. Neither of those characteristics are very shrew-like. Shrews have very short legs, and they kind of rummage through the underbrush. These can actually run quite quickly, and they usually maintain a system of trails. What I think is quite ironic is it turns out that these are closer relatives of elephants than they are of shrews. These belong in that superordinal group Aphrotheria, which includes elephants, sea cows, hyraxes, tenrecs, and the elephant shrews. They are placed in their own family, Macrosolididae, and in their own order, Macrosolidia. So just like with the tree shrews, this is a whole separate branch of the placental family tree. And there are only 21 branches. So being able to see these 2 separate branches right next to one another, I think is really pretty cool. And unfortunately, a lot of people just don't know that. So now you do, so go take a look at them. They're also, I believe, in the primate house, if I recognize that green background there correctly. They are diurnal, again, not shrew-like, territorial, so they carve off their own little territories, and they snuffle through the underbrush eating insects. That's about the only thing that's shrew-like about them. David Attenborough has some great videos of little sengies, they're also known as. So you can look that up on YouTube. The greater Malayan chevrotain, Tragulus napu. This is in the rainforest exhibit at the zoo. This is a tiny fruit-eating ungulate of Southeast Asia. Usually we think of ungulates as grazers or browsers, but in fact, when you're very small as an ungulate, you tend to eat fruit. Now, why would this make my somewhat top 10 list of interesting animals that you should check out in Ohio? It's because it's probably similar to the earliest ruminants, which evolved some 55 million years ago. And we think that it managed to continue to eke out a living in these tropical forests of Southeast Asia. It's in its own family, Tragulidae, related to the larger group, the order Artiodactyla, that includes things like deer and antelope and cows. The other thing that's neat about them is that males have saber teeth. And it doesn't get any cooler than that. This is what a skull looks like. And look at those chompers. That's how these animals battle. There's a relationship between body size and your anatomy if you are a bovid or related to these ruminants. And these small ones tend to battle with sabers, whereas the bigger ones get horns and antlers. And if you take a close look when you're at the zoo, you can see a little white sticking out under the gum, and that's going to be the saber teeth of the male Shepherdtain. Sticking with deer, Pear David's deer is kind of a cool one. And to this, you have to go to the wilds. Has anyone been to the wilds? It's a, all right, one person. It's a reclaimed strip mine down by Cumberland. It's about 2.5 hours away. I think the reason I first went there is because my in-laws live in that area. It's a beautiful place. It's like a game preserve. They have all these big pens that you can go through, and they have herds of large ungulates, and this is one of them. Why would this make my list? It just looks like another deer. It turns out it's a close relative of elk, very close relative, that prefers marshy areas. They're kind of funny looking. They're in the same family as deer, family Cervidae, so it's not like their own family. What's neat about these is that they are China natives that were reintroduced into the wild after they went extinct. And it's a cool story of they were basically hunted to extinction, and the only person that had a herd of them was a Chinese emperor. And he wasn't letting anyone have them, but some Europeans managed to smuggle some out and start a colony of them in England. Subsequently, there was a Boxer Rebellion, and there was a flood that broke down the wall around the palace. And the long and the short of it is they went extinct in China. And it was only because there was a stolen population in England that they then bred that we now have them here, and they've been repopulated into China. So it's a really cool story of a way to save what's a pretty cool, charismatic animal. And on top of it, these things apparently decorate their antlers with sticks and vegetation. This is not a great picture, but I took this at the wilds, and look at that. It's like a 2x4 size thing that's 6 feet long, and he's just hanging out. And you'll see him with moss on there too. So antlers are all about combat and attracting the females, and I guess that's what these deer do. That's worth seeing them right there. You got to put the naked mole rat on the top 10 list. Probably needs no introduction. Now you can see them at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, brought back by popular demand in conjunction with Nature's Mating Games. When that finishes, which I think is next spring, you can still see them at the Cleveland Metro Park Zoo. They're so ugly, they are absolutely adorable. They are heterothermic. They also can't regulate their body temperature very well because they're naked. They live underground completely in Africa, and they have to be at a certain depth so they don't get too hot, but they also maintain a certain level of warmth. The claim to fame of these guys is that they're the only eusocial mammals, which means they're essentially the mammal version of an ant or a wasp. They have a single queen that reproduces, just a handful of males that get to mate with her, and everyone else is either a worker or a soldier. They're in their own family, Bathyergidae, although in fact there are other mole rats that aren't eusocial. So it's only 2 species within this family that are actually eusocial, and this is one of them. The way they dig is with their teeth. They're chisel-tooth diggers, and they feed on tubers underground. And if you look at their skull, you can see how their incisors are very procumbent. They stick out. They chew into the dirt with that, and they can close their lips behind it so that they're not swallowing the dirt. Pretty cool way to dig. Last but certainly not least, the aardvark, which is ironic because, of course, it's always first in your list of animals. Yes, because it's before the aardwolf. It's the largest burrowing mammal in the world, which is its claim to fame, and it lives in Africa. And it's important ecologically because even though it digs all these burrows, it doesn't live them all the time, and other animals will invade them later on. And so they're important keystone species for that ecosystem. They mostly eat termites, so they're very powerful diggers, and also these things called aardvark cucumbers. They are in their own family, and they are in their own order. This is one of 2 branches of mammals that's just hanging on by a thread. This one and the Monito del Monte. They are the only species of their entire order, which must be pretty lonely. So for that reason, you should go check them out down in Cincinnati. And it's named for its peculiar teeth, the tabula dentata part, which are formed of hexagonal prisms of dentine. And that's a close-up of what they look like there. Not that you can see the dentine. So I think you'd agree we've got a pretty spectacular radiation of mammals going on right now. And my real passion for going out and studying the fossil ones are to answer the questions, how did this biodiversity evolve? And perhaps more importantly, how do we maintain it? And I'd like to thank all these folks that unwillingly or unknowingly at least donated some photos for my talk. Many were my own. And I'd be glad to entertain any more questions.